Coming up.
We've never been more connected, by the way, in the history of humanity, but we've also probably never been more lonely. And that's super broken. And I think part of that brokenness is social media. We're fed this myth that if I scroll through a feed of my friends' pictures, I somehow am engaging in a relationship.
From 2003 Media, I'm Campbell Barron, and this is The Ones Who Succeed. Welcome to the program. Hello.
Campbell.
Tim, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
If I may ask before we start here, what did you think of the social dilemma?
I was pretty happy with how it turned out. I think, and I was pleasantly surprised how much it resonated with folks. So, I think the filmmaker took some dramatic and sensationalist license, but, it was probably appropriate.
I think what you said about how it resonated with people, I think you're absolutely right there. Today on the program, I'm thrilled to have a conversation with Tim Kendall.
I was the co-inventor of the Facebook like button.
I was the president of Pinterest,
Google, Twitter, Instagram.
There were meaningful changes happening around the world because of these platforms. I think we were naive about the flip side of that coin.
So this is a clip from the trailer of the popular Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma. And more specifically, the guy who said we were naive about the flip side of that coin, that is someone by the name of Tim Kendall. And Tim is a Silicon Valley veteran. In 2006, he joined a startup on the rise, founded by a Harvard dropout aimed at making the world more open and connected. And Tim's role as the director of monetization at this startup, which was Facebook, was to essentially figure out how the company was going to make money. And so, that's what Tim did. He worked on products at Facebook aimed at generating revenue for the company, products that ultimately inspired the business model of many major social platforms to follow. Tim then joined Pinterest, initially as their head of product, and then becoming president in 2015. However, while Tim was immersed in the world of Silicon Valley, making decisions that affected millions and millions of users every day, he began to start to think about the flip side of that coin, as he put it, a flip side that, as depicted in The Social Dilemma, has some pretty major consequences. Consequences that today Tim is looking to repair as the CEO of Moment. Tim, based in San Francisco, joined this program via Zoom to discuss his entry point into the world of technology, his time at Facebook and Pinterest, building products that touched millions and millions of users all over the world, and of course, why in 2018 he bid Pinterest farewell and stepped into the CEO role at Moment, a company that helps over 8 million people build healthier relationships with their phones. That's all coming up. My conversation with Moment CEO Tim Kendall starts now. Tim, I appreciate your time. Great to get to talk to you.
Thanks for having me on.
So I'm fascinated by your story. I'm a user of Moment. I'm really interested in what you're doing, and I want to get into that. But if you can briefly introduce yourself, who are you and what do you do?
Yeah, so Tim Kendall. I have worked really in and around technology since I got out of college, 20 years ago. I started working really as a venture capital investor. Yeah, so investing, and then went to graduate school, and then ended up at Facebook when it was about 100 folks, a few million users, and looking to kind of lock in on what the business model would be for the company. So watch that business kind of go from really nothing to almost a $2 billion business at the time that I left. And then spent 6 years at Pinterest as their president. Not at the beginning, but I was their first executive hire. And there were about 15 folks when I joined. Again, kind of a few million users. And then when I left, it was, on $1 billion run rate, and we had, 200 or 300 million users. And now, as you alluded to, I run a company called Moment, and Moment is really focused on giving people back their agency as it relates to, these technology services. I think we've lost control of our lives in some sense, and certainly lost control over how we use our phones for lots of different aspects of our life. And so what Moment is focused on is really helping people develop an awareness around just how much their phones have taken over their lives and just how much they've lost control, and then giving them a few different services that help them get back in control.
So this is really interesting. So you gave me quite a nice overview of like your career trajectory thus far. And I really want to get into a lot of the stuff you're doing with Moment because that's what you're working on now. But I think before we get into that, I want to highlight your time at Facebook. Because you mentioned you joined the company when there were a couple million users and saw it scale to 1 billion plus users, and that is like that's growth that you'll probably never see ever again in your entire life. It's just once in a there are a handful of companies who will ever have that growth trajectory. If my research was correct, this was 2006.
Yes.
Yeah. So what Facebook was like in 2006?
Well, it was really a college website. There were profiles, people had profiles, and there was no news feed. It was just, a bunch of discrete profiles that you could have viewing access to if you were quote unquote friends. And it was wildly popular in college. There was a level of engagement. The notion that of all the users that were on the service, half of them were coming back every day. I mean, no one had seen that. No one had seen that in any type of service or technology at that point. And so internally, externally, people were sort of enamored by that level of engagement. In retrospect, I think some of that was that, voyeurism and vanity and popularity and comparison are very powerful things to prey on. And I don't know that I know there wasn't sort of this calculating effort to prey on those sorts of things. It's almost that Mark and team had sort of happened upon all those levers, and it was magical in that sense. The company was run by Mark, and Mark was 20 years old at the time, and you could tell that he was brilliant, but he was also very young and very inexperienced and very shy. He didn't really talk to many people as he was sort of walking through the office. I didn't meet him during my interview process. I met him later on, and it was dysfunctional, right? It wasn't really clear how stuff got done or what the process was for products being built and shipped. And and this is what people will tell you about the early days at lots of companies. It's super messy. And there is not some overarching playbook that you're referring back to. You're kind of making it up as you go. And it's remarkable at that stage just how dysfunctional and sloppy it feels. Even though, you look back in retrospect and like, wow, we were creating something, that became just dominating in the world. But it wasn't obvious then. And, it's also worth noting that in 2006, well, Facebook is 4 or 5 million users. MySpace in the US was 100 million users. Right. And that's all anyone was talking about. Mm-hmm. I remember a month into my time at Facebook thinking, oh boy, I hope I didn't join the wrong company.
Oh my God. That's hilarious in hindsight. I think this is really interesting that you highlight the dysfunction, because the story of Facebook's effect on the world now told by the press and the story told by an insider seems very, very different. If I was going to write a novel, this is the story I would choose, was that Facebook was planning to steal people's attention from day one. The plan was to sell ads against your attention. And that's a good story. That's a really good story. But it seems like that was a byproduct of the overarching mission. And it was a byproduct that one of the quotes you used in the film, which I thought was fantastic, was that you were naive of the flip side of that coin. And I think that basically says it all. Your role at Facebook was director of monetization, which I'm going to make an assumption here that Facebook wasn't making that much money before you came, and your job was essentially to figure out the revenue models for the company. How did your decisions ultimately impact Facebook later on?
Well, I basically, when I got there, ran a process whereby we explored, and look, keep in mind that things are dysfunctional. So running a process like this was pretty haphazard. There were projects that were happening that were kind of quote unquote part of that process, but I didn't really have necessarily control over. Like there was a team of really talented people who were working on virtual gifts and virtual goods as a possible business. And I didn't direct them to go do that. They did it on their own. And I kind of just kept tabs and thought, okay, well, let's just see how this goes. How engaging is it for users? How much money does it make? And there were a couple of we created a classified service. We flirted with the idea of having some users pay, or we thought about, well, what if we did advertising, but you could pay to not see ads if you wanted an ad-free experience. And so we looked at all of these and we came up with a bunch of decision parameters. How fast was the market growing? Did users like it? How quickly could we build a business to support, this explosive service that wasn't free to serve to users. It was ultimately going to cost, once we got to real scale, hundreds of millions of dollars a year to provide. I and others, and I certainly helped corral, and Sheryl Sandberg was a part of this too, the company to, we're in the advertising business. And that is the business that we're going to be in. That's how we're going to make money off this service. And that was, I would say, in the 07, 08 timeframe, that wasn't an easy process to get people to agree to that. I think there were a lot of people who had within the company, particularly kind of the early 20-somethings, who had a lot of skepticism around advertising as being a manipulative medium. And I think that, the more pragmatic folks like me were like, look, if we're really honest with ourselves, this is basically a media business. Media businesses, for the life of media businesses being in existence, have been ad supported. It just makes sense to do ads. Google, who all of us admire, they make money off of ads. And we've got information on users. So it's going to be this wonderful thing where we'll be able to allow advertisers to target people based on all the information that users freely give us. And so I was a big advocate because I thought first of all, I thought the service was net good for the world. And the more readily we could come up with a business model and scale that business, we could get it out to more people. And, we wanted to win, and we wanted to win on the measure of how many people are using this. And I wanted to win in terms of how big of a business can we build.
So what was the ripple effect of that decision?
Well,
coming up on The Ones Who Succeed, I continue my conversation with Tim Kendall. We'll be right back after this. Welcome back to The Ones Who Succeed and my conversation with Moment CEO, Tim Kendall. What was the ripple effect of that decision?
Well, in retrospect, it had a tremendous ripple effect, because what it created was a business model that was predicated upon extracting attention from users. And that paired with this all-knowing artificial intelligence that really knew the user better than they knew themselves. I think that intersection of the attention-based business model and then an all-knowing algorithm that gets better and better and better, that has led us to where we are today, where the system and the services have to, and they're publicly traded companies, they're evaluated on quarterly earnings. They have to, in order to sustain the value of the company and grow it over time, they have to show persistent growth of revenue and earnings. And that is predicated on getting Campbell and Tim to spend more time tomorrow and the next day on the service than they did today. And the way that the algorithm does that is to show you something that's more interesting, something that keeps your attention longer. And that is increasingly becoming incendiary content.
Right.
Right. And incendiary content has significant ramifications for what happens to our society and to United States democracy. It also has ramifications for our mental health. So the knock-on effects were dramatic. And if you wanted to be especially dramatic, you could say existential. But I don't think we know that yet. But dramatic in terms of very disruptive to individuals and to society in a way that we never anticipated.
So I see two ripple effects. I see one on which you talked about, right? The consumer. But Facebook was one of the early social platforms that's actually still, thriving today. You mentioned MySpace, Friendster, I don't know any others. I'm sure there were many more that are no longer around. As a result, the startups that were founded post Facebook, Facebook was like the growing incumbent in the space. And so the second ripple effect that I see, and you had this experience at Pinterest, but when other fast-growing social products are looking at what potential revenue models look like in the space, you can't help but look at Facebook and see that their ad model is working really, really well. So this incentive that touches Facebook's billion plus users at the time, towards when you left, is also carried on to other platforms that touches their 100 million plus user platforms. And then that kind of spirals into its own thing. So am I correct in that assumption in saying that other social platforms at the time really looked at Facebook and considered kind of their revenue model for their own purposes?
Yeah, it's something I haven't explicitly thought about, but that's totally right. Much in the same way that we were admirers of Google's business and even Yahoo's business at the time. Both advertising supported, both hyper growth. And there's no question now, if you look at what Snap has done and TikTok has done and Twitter has done, that has been in large part because, well, they're all media companies. And it turns out that this path has been walked down before. And where most people end up is, the ad business is a pretty good business.
For Facebook.
For Facebook.
And those big platforms. I think that's interesting that you say media company, because I don't think they like to think of themselves as
they hate that distinction. But that is, I mean, if we're thinking about it just in the abstract, like a media company is something that you consume that entertains you. They think of themselves as a technology company. And certainly there's technology that powers that, but ultimately what the user sees is media.
And that distinction also powers how they're looked at from a regulation perspective. Publications that are typical, like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, typical legacy media companies, are looked at very different than Facebook in terms of content moderation.
That's absolutely
and
right.
So I see why, they would not be as okay with that, because ultimately, like you mentioned, they're a public company, cuts into their bottom line. And Facebook, this juggernaut now, is still really the giant in the space. But eventually you became head of product at Pinterest, and then president at Pinterest. And Pinterest was also going around, a similar period or later on, but went through a similar phase from my understanding, which is like, how do we make money? And it seemed like Pinterest also kind of decided to go the ad route and build a network. And obviously very different product, very different demographic, but still, a similar business model. And so walk me through what you saw internally. What were the differences from the inside between those two companies? I have to imagine completely different cultures. And again, your time at Pinterest.
Yeah, I mean, definitely different cultures and a different period in time, right? I mean, as part of this, I'll explain why I don't really think of Pinterest as a social media company.
All right.
Facebook is ultimately about learning about what's happening with your friends and family, as are most social networks, right? I mean, TikTok has blurred that a little bit because it's now sort of learning about, the stranger that's doing a funny dance, but there is a social component that's about, okay, what are my friends doing? And that turns out to be, one of the most engaging aspects of the product. And so one of the challenges early days with Facebook was, well, how do you show ads for products and services and interweave them with content that's about your friends and family? And isn't that going to be orthogonal and weird? And by the way, it was for a long time and still is sometimes, depending on the user experience you're having. Pinterest, you basically are browsing a catalog. It's a catalog of ideas, and many of them are products. And so it actually was a lot more straightforward to imagine adding advertising to the mix and it not being that disruptive or orthogonal. We didn't have the debate about whether advertising was going to be the best business or not. It's like, it's going to be an advertising business. Mm-hmm. There's also not the same, in my view, and certainly when I was at the company, we just didn't have an emphasis on getting Campbell to spend as much time as possible on Pinterest. The goal was much more oriented towards putting the best thing in front of you and actually compelling you to take action on that idea. So if it was a recipe, we actually were building tools that allowed you to get off of your phone and go cook it. Or if
That's the opposite.
That's the opposite. And in fact, if you look at the raw time spent on Pinterest per user, it's not that impressive. Mm-hmm. And in a sense, it doesn't really need to be. By the way, the raw time spent on Google search is not that impressive either, because you go there, you tell them what you're looking for, and then they send you there. And then you're off of Google.
And so I like that distinction. So Pinterest was spending a lot of time focusing on how to make the content that you see as personalized as possible to you, so you can go take action and do something, if you will. And you were saying that at Facebook, the discussion was really like, how can we get people to use this more than we did yesterday?
And it was, I remember having conversations about, okay, we got a lot of people who are on this service 15 days out of 30 in a month. How do we get them to be 30 out of 30 or 28 out of 30?
Does that not feel weird though, saying that? Like at the time, did that not feel at all like a little bit of an issue?
I know in retrospect, it seems like that should have thrown a caution flag in our brain. It just didn't. It just didn't. And I wish that it had. And I'm trying to sort of put in words why I don't think it did. Well, look at media companies. They're trying to get more people to watch their shows, right? Radio shows are you're trying to get more people to listen to your podcast.
I care about my retention, Tim. I care about the retention.
And you don't get in trouble with it because you're not at the same scale, and you can't personalize what you're saying to the however many people are listening to this in a way that resonates so much that they won't be able to pull themselves away. Mm-hmm. And I think maybe that was part of it too, was that we just didn't quite realize the power that the service and ultimately the algorithm was going to have over people's time and attention.
The attention economy, if you will. And the social dilemma, from my perspective, seemed to kind of simultaneously touch on two various problems, if you will. The whole false news, fake news thing is widely discussed, but since I'm kind of in this age group and I see it, I'm really interested in the side effects of social media usage on kids and teens, because it is a problem that I think is actually very serious, and I'm sure you think so too.
Yeah. I think it's corrosive psychologically to every age group. I don't think just because you're 30 or 40, you're somehow immune from it screwing up your brain. The research does seem to suggest just because younger brains are more malleable, that there may be a more pronounced effect for young folks. And in fact, I think the film highlights some stats that are super alarming. Girls aged 10 to 14 in the last 10 years, suicide rates have tripled. Hospitalizations from incidents of self-harm has gone up 5x. And then there are a number of studies that suggest that the brain changes, right? That usage corresponds with thinning in the prefrontal cortex, which is, our executive function in our brain. It's actually the part of the brain that makes us really distinct from animals. And then another brain change they've seen in kids or teenagers is that the animal part of the brain, the part that sort of manages our impulsiveness, there's gray matter thinning around that part of the animal brain, so around the amygdala. The same type of gray matter thinning that they see corresponding with higher degrees of cocaine addiction. It's super clear from the data that these services change our brain. I don't know that I have not seen the research, it may exist, that shows how resilient, I do think part of it being malleable is that, and we've seen this at Moment actually, not neurologically, but we've seen that the 20-somethings and the teens are more easily able to change their habits with the same type of coaching programs than the 30s or 40-somethings, which probably does suggest adaptability, resilience, and some sort of brain malleability. But there's no question these services wreak havoc among kids. we talk to a lot of families at the moment, and it's not the most popular thing when I say this to parents because they don't really want to hear it. I think there's a vicious cycle whereby I think these services are addicting parents just as they're addicting kids. And I think that parents are on their phones much more than they often want to be. And modeling is a really powerful thing in families and in life. Kids are much more influenceable by what you do than what you say. Or it may be what you say, but it's got to be in congruence with what you do. And parents, I think, in my experience, the average parent that I talk to does not want to hear that.
I mean, I would admit that seems, that seems about right. It would make sense why they wouldn't want to hear it. But I agree with you, it's a problem. All right, we're going to take one last quick break and we'll be right back with Moment CEO Tim Kendall. That's all ahead on The Ones Who Succeed. Stay with us. You're listening to The Ones Who Succeed and my conversation with Moment CEO Tim Kendall. I'm Campbell Barron. Welcome back to the program. One of the sayings I hear a lot in the world of startups is this idea of building, quote, habit-forming products. And I actually don't necessarily think this is always a bad thing because I'm a user of Headspace and their incentives with their streaks and their incentives with, their notifications, it is like an addictive product, but I think the outcome of that is positive. And so I would say in that sense, habit forming is a good thing.
I think I could say the same thing about Peloton or other services where, the brilliance of I think the Headspace business as a service and even the Peloton business as a service is that your individual well-being and improving that is absolutely aligned with the best interests of the company. That alignment does not exist with these social media companies. It doesn't.
But like this is very doomsday situation talk. But like Facebook doesn't seem likely that the company will go away anytime soon. If a grown adult like yourself can come to the conclusion that wow, this is actually really difficult to pull back on, how do we get ourselves out of this situation? Because ultimately, I think whether these have long-term effects on health, that study has to take place. How do we unscrew ourselves, if you will?
Well, I think that the predecessor to this era, which, let's call it big social, was, there's big food, there's big sugar, there's big tobacco, there's big oil, right? And so we do have a playbook for regulating products that aren't good for us. And we've seen that playbook with cigarettes through taxation and disclosure. Cigarette companies have had to become much more overt about the harms. It's in big writing on these products. And there's huge taxation to the extent that you still want to use these products. And so in my mind, I think we've got to put, these AI-powered big social services through that same playbook and sort of figure out, okay, how can we regulate these things such that they don't create the kind of harm that they've created historically? What I would like to see, and this is like the more sort of the dream scenario, and so there are aspects of this arc that I'll describe that many people might say are unrealistic, but to me it feels like the leaders of these big social companies, governments, and then key leaders within consumer advocacy ideally would get together. They would align on the fact that, all right, we're in a pretty bad place. Like we screwed up. Consumers, we screwed up. We let it happen. We were complicit. The government didn't do anything to stop it. They screwed up. And then the companies in their own way messed up, right? They certainly didn't have any social responsibility as they built these things. And they've kind of, screwed their end user. So I wonder if those groups could get together and say, all right, well, what's the path out? Is there a way we could co-create a path out where we don't destroy tons of market cap and value? We don't want to destroy all these companies because the economic consequences would be dire, but we got to change. So I wonder if there is a way through penalties and incentives, probably huge tax incentives, to make it possible for a Facebook at $100 billion in revenue to segue to a different kind of a business model over a 5 or 10 year period. Not unlike how auto manufacturers have had to segue from gas guzzling engines to ultimately, zero emissions battery technology. We need the battery powered solar Facebook business model. And, Tristan says this really well in the movie, Tristan Harris in the Social Dilemma says, look, we don't have a choice. We have to. There is increasingly consensus that I am hearing and reading about that, clearly climate change is an existential threat. Mm-hmm. AI unchecked is an existential threat. And this is a precursor test. How are we going to deal with this? Because it's making us sick and it's eroding society. And we haven't even seen how bad it can get. Mm-hmm. So how do we deal with this litmus test? Do we, get aggressive and figure out how to get some sort of aligned path out of this? And I think it's tractable, but it will require some humility and intellectual honesty on all sides.
You joined Moment as their CEO in 2018. This is right after you left Pinterest. Moment's core offering is a mobile app that tracks your screen time, among other things. But that was the core product. I believe it was founded in 2013. Yeah. And as the CEO of this app, you have seemed to be working to expand the horizons of the core business beyond the singular app that tracks screen time. And I'd be curious to hear what you're working on in regards to some of the products that you were excited about and kind of how the business is structured these days.
Yeah, I think that I am personally very interested in the problem of helping people get out of their own way. There are many ways in which people are an impediment to their own progress. And by the way, I'm so interested in this because it's a constant struggle for me on a day-to-day basis. I eat too much sugar at night. I probably drink too much coffee in the morning. And I think it's a fascinating human problem to try to figure out, how do you help human beings make decisions in the near term that are aligned with who they want to be in the medium and long term? And I actually think technology can play a part in that. That's a little bit what Moment tries to do as it relates to screen time, right? Mm-hmm. In the medium and long term, we want to be that person who has willpower and doesn't spend 5 hours a day on our phone. But in the shortest time horizon, we are bored and uncomfortable when we're sitting on our couch in our living room, and we just want to maybe just get a little bit of soothing and comfort from our phone. And so we grab it and we look at it. And there's an opportunity there, right, to pick a different behavior that is more congruent with how I want to be. And I think there's a similar challenge with our relationships, our social behavior. And what I mean by that is that I think that particularly in the age of social media, where we're given this false antidote of I think, we've never been more connected, by the way, in the history of humanity, but we've also probably never been more lonely. And that's super broken. And I think part of that brokenness is social media. We're fed this myth that if I scroll through a feed of my friends' pictures, I somehow am engaging in a relationship. And I'm not. Not only am I scrolling through a feed of friends, I'm also scrolling through a feed of pictures of friend 743 who I don't even care about and who I might even find a little bit annoying. And I think there's a big opportunity to take that time and attention that I spend directed at this false antidote and instead use that time and attention to actually cultivate and sustain the relationships I care about most. And this is a hard problem, but instead of spending an hour on my phone tonight after my kids go to bed, why don't I call one of my closest friends in Wyoming and check in and see how he's doing? I think about that. I think about doing that probably every other day, and I don't do it. I get on my phone. If we fast forward to the very end of your life, we know that, by the way, that will be further out. And by the way, you will report a much more satisfied life if you have invested and cultivated relationships with the 5, 10, 15 people who matter most. Mm-hmm. But most people get to the end of their lives and they don't do it. And right before they take their last breath, they say, shit, I wish I had spent more time cultivating those relationships. And so we think there's an interesting opportunity with technology to help you prioritize those things now. So what we're working on, and there's nothing to talk about now publicly, but what we're working on are experiences and services that could help you with that problem.
Do you see an opportunity for a new wave of products using technology to tackle this problem?
I do. I mean, I think that there are two things that we're talking about here that I think technology is really well suited to. I think the first is attention management. Is my time and attention being, allocated in a way that's congruent with who I want to be?
Mm-hmm.
And most of the time, I'll speak for myself, it's not. It's gotten better, but it's not exactly aligned. And I think that because of the sensors and all the controls and power on this device, it actually could be a wonderful aid to me. And, unfortunately, the incentives of the companies that build this device and the companies that build the services are to just get you to spend as much time as possible. And in part is the reason for that is that we're not paying for a bunch of things on here. If I could pay for a service that I knew was going to help me with my health and well-being, what a great service that would be. What an interesting business that would be. And the knock-on effects for society and people's psychological well-being could be really powerful.
And the company's incentives are shared by the user's incentives.
100%.
Mm-hmm.
And that's exciting.
Tim, it's been a pleasure.
Likewise. Thanks for your time.
That's Tim Kendall, one of the ones who succeed. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this show, it would be amazing if you could leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps us out. Or why not tell a friend? That also helps new listeners discover the show. I really appreciate it. You can catch new episodes of The Ones Who Succeed on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your shows. Or catch our full video episodes, clips, and more on the Ones Who Succeed YouTube channel. Consider subscribing. As for me, I'm at Campbell J. Barron on Twitter and Instagram. The podcast is at TOWSUCCEED, Toes Succeed, on TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. All right, you've made it to the end of the show. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. I'm Campbell Barron. I'll be back next week.